So good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. I'll just say a few quick words before I introduce Leah, but I just want to say what an absolute delight it is to be here for our first ever master's thesis or project presentation. Steve and I were just talking, and we figured out the program is 18 years now, and this is a really historical moment. And having master's thesis as an option is part of the many ideas we've developed in response to our conversation with you to make the program better and to put you into the best possible position when you leave the program for your future job searches and interviews and so on. And I think obviously we have other things, as you know. We've increased emphasis on skill building and on workshops and introduced tracks and many other things we're working on. We're also in serious sort of debates about how to make the program more affordable. All of this is part of course, this desire to put you in the best possible position when you leave here. I should think that a master's from Brown is a good starting point, of course, in the first place, but coming with a master's thesis makes it even better. And the third point is we are hoping to start a publication series. We've talked with the publisher starting in the fall about public humanities, and we hope that some of your thesis will actually end up in the publication. So if you have a master's from Brown and a thesis and a publication, you might be in a good position for your job interviews. And so just wanted to say how delighted and grateful we are that you took us up on that offer and that we can listen to you presenting your thesis now. And on that note, I think I'll hand it over to Leah Van Wey, who is not only the Dean of the School of Professional Studies and our graduate advisor, but she is also, of course, just got promoted. I think some of you might know, but not everyone knows that she's already sort of preparing for it as our new Dean of the Faculty, one of the key positions in the university. So, great. Thank you.
Great. And so, I am super excited to have this chance to introduce the theses presentations today. So as Dietrich said, I get to take over as Dean of the Faculty this year, and one of the best things about that is getting to know all of the things that happen across the university. And so I wanted to start by saying thank you all for giving me the time this semester to get to know your work and this center and all of you a little bit better. And so I'm super excited to be able to hear more about the work that you've been doing today. And so I'm going to provide brief introductions for each student who is presenting a thesis project. I'm also just going to say a few things about logistics. So we have folks who are joining us on Zoom, and we have folks who are joining us here in the room. Sabina is monitoring the Zoom chat, and so folks who are on Zoom, if you want to ask questions when you get to the Q&A period, you can either write the question in the chat and Sabina will read it, or you can make a note saying that you would like to be called on and we'll ask you to speak. And so each of the speakers is going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll have the 5 to 10 minutes for Q&A after that. And so our first speaker today is Felicia Bartley, who came here with a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Colorado at Boulder. And she's going to be presenting today a thesis that is entitled Indian People Cultural Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. And she was supported in this work by Bob Purcell, who is here today, and Adrian Keene at Brown University, as well as an external committee member, Theodore Hobola from the University of New Mexico. Hopefully I got that name right. So come on up.
Hinamakima Yanapaftehan. I can't remember how old I was, only that I was still attending classes at our Isleta Elementary School. While I cannot remember my age, I remember the pulse of the beating drums, and beat per beat, I remember lifting my guff, landing upon the fine sand, and what I hoped was synchrony with other dancers around me. I can't remember their faces, but I remember the drums. I remember the feeling of wholeness, dancing for the very first time for something other than myself. This memory is the source of the fondness in my heart that I hold for the Indian Pueblo Cultural Center. Hello everyone, my name is Felicia Bartley, and I'm here to speak with you today about my thesis research on the Indian Pueblo Culture Center in Albuquerque, New Mexico. So before I begin, I'm gonna do this, because you don't need to see me, because you already see me. And I want to bring you to the center of my world, which lies here in Pueblo country. So on this map created by the Indian Pueblo Culture Center, you can see where the Pueblos are in these little small houses alongside our tribal neighbors. My home is here in Isleta, Pueblo. There are 19 of us in New Mexico, and we have a sister Pueblo down south in Texas. We are all distinct from each other. We have our own systems of governance, sovereignty, and even language. But we also share a lot in common. When I first decided that I wanted to attend graduate school, I knew that I wanted to focus on Pueblo culture centers as examples of decolonization, or better yet, indigenization, and for my Pueblo peers, Pueblofication. As I worked in the summer of 2020 on a literature review of Pueblo culture centers, I noticed something. I had assumed that the Indian Pueblo Culture Center would be well represented in the academic literature as it's existed since 1976. Yet to my surprise, I found that there was no scholarly monograph or detailed study available. Its foundational history is largely absent from the scholarly record. As an Isleta woman who has been positively affected by the Pueblo Culture Center, I wanted to give back. I wanted to fill in this gap in literature, but beyond that, I also wanted to express my sincerest gratitude to the institution and place that made me aware of my heartline. So as you can imagine, I quickly pivoted my research to give back to the Indian Pueblo Culture Center. It's a significant gap in the literature that I hope I can begin to address. The center is a unique institution that is collectively owned by the 19 Pueblos in New Mexico. It is not the project of any one Pueblo, and its mission statement states that it is responsible for preserving and perpetuating Pueblo culture and advancing understanding by presenting with dignity and respect the accomplishments and evolving history of the Pueblo people of New Mexico. The center features a museum, gallery space, mural collection, collections of Pueblo art, an outside plaza, library and archives, education department, a restaurant, cultural programming and events. In addition, it also features a cultural dance program, which allows tourists to observe and watch Pueblo social dances in the plaza. Its history is linked to that of the former Albuquerque Indian School. In fact, it's built adjacent to the grounds of the school. And here are some contemporary images of what the center currently offers right now. And one item that I want to highlight is that currently the center is featuring a show honoring a really precious and wonderful human being and artist, Deanna Autumnleaf Suazo, who we lost too soon due to ongoing violence towards Native women. Yesterday, May 5th, was the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls. I highly encourage you to gain an understanding on your own time to why a National Day of Awareness exists. But my purpose today isn't to tell you about the center as it exists in its contemporary form, but rather my thesis research was to examine the history of the Indian Pueblo Culture Center during the period from 1966 to 1976, as you can see circled here. So once again, before I begin, I need to give a little bit more contextual info. First is the All Pueblo Council of Governors, also known as the All Indian Pueblo Council. And this is so you know to whom I refer to when I say the council. The council is an important starting point to understand the foundation of the Indian Pueblo Culture Center. The council is comprised of the elected governors of the 20 pueblos. The council rotates as frequently as any given pueblo holds their electoral process. The elected officials who serve upon the All Indian Pueblo Council represent the needs of their respective pueblo constituents. The council exists as a central point of communication between the 20 pueblo and external governments. And external is important because that means that the council does not influence nor does it interfere with each individual pueblo's government or our communities, but advocates on behalf of all the pueblos. They are a main figure in the development of the center. The center demonstrates how the council advocates for the well-being and protection of pueblo peoples, in which case we can read their mission statement, which is to advocate, foster, protect, and encourage the social, cultural, traditional well-being of our Pueblo nations by promoting language, health, economic, and educational advancement of all Pueblo people. And I would argue that the center is a product of such advocacy and protection that in turn fosters and encourages Pueblo people's well-being. It is from this legacy of protection and advocacy that the Albuquerque Indian School became a focus for the council. The school was situated in Albuquerque, New Mexico, directly across the street from the present-day Indian Pueblo Culture Center. It was founded in 1881 by the Presbyterian Board of Home Missions and transferred to the United States government in 1886. When the school was founded, its mission was to encourage Native children through education to abandon traditional lifeways and assimilate into the dominant American society. 100 years after its opening in 1981, the school was officially closed due to safety concerns. However, this is a very fast and flat history of the school. This overview does not nearly capture the rich history of the school, including the period in 1976, the same year as the center's opening, when the council was the first tribal organization to take responsibility and control of a federally ran boarding school within the United States. So the school became a focus for the council in 1966, when the federal government began to plan and discuss the possibility of abandoning the school to make a new one on the west side of the Rio Grande. This prompted a meeting in Washington, D.C. on April 25, 1966, between the council's then chairman, Domingo Montoya, and the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, where, as the secretary was leaving for the west, Chairman Montoya walked with him down the hall to the elevator and asked that the council be given title to the federal land and buildings of the present Albuquerque School. This began a years-long negotiation process between the All-Indian Pueblo Council, the council's legal attorney, Thomas Olson, the Secretary of the Interior, Stuart Udall, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, including the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Robert L. Bennett, the Deputy Undersecretary for Programs, Harry Shushan, the Interior Solicitor, Mr. Tolliver, Interior Attorneys, and the New Mexico Senator, Clinton P. Anderson. In every step of the way, the council consistently proposed the use of the land to host an arts and crafts center that would feature an experiential education center for the promotion of creative and economic opportunities for Pueblo peoples. In 1968, the Interior Solicitor, Mr. Tolliver, acknowledged that the Secretary of the Interior could designate each Pueblo as a recipient of the All-Indian School land. On June 17, 1969, after a few more obstacles from Senator Anderson, the Acting Commissioner of Indian Affairs signed a deed transferring 11.6 acres to the 19 Pueblos to hold in common, which is this here. And this historic land transfer occurred during the Nixon administration. Initially, the council requested to have the Albuquerque Indian School's 54 acres transferred to the All-Indian Pueblo Council, which was not approved. Instead, in 1969, the federal government deeded 11.6 acres that were adjacent to the Albuquerque Indian School, as you saw in that previous photo. The surplus land was deeded to each individual Pueblo rather than the council. Major actors in this stretch of time that allowed us, the Pueblos, to regain attractive land in the heart of Albuquerque are the members of the All-Indian Pueblo Council, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Secretary of the Interior, Sophie Aberle, Thomas Olson, Charles Wilkinson, and Jeffrey Donfield. In the end, the United States Code, Section 25, Section 239A, paved the way for Pueblos to regain land in the heart of Albuquerque. So the founding of the Indian Pueblo Culture Center from 1970 to 1976 reveals the skill and persistence of Pueblo leaders in working with federal, state, church, and private organizations to control the representation of our own heritage and the practice of our own educational needs. The choice to build the center in the form of Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon, which is an ancient ancestral Puebloan site, which you see here, is a direct statement of the persistence and continuity of Pueblo histories and presences in the past, present, and into the future. The various project delays due to fundraising challenges, while frustrating, had the benefit of allowing additional goals to be incorporated into the center. For example, new ambitions were announced in 1975. These involved housing a radio station, a Pueblo newspaper, a library and archives facility, housing for repatriated items, a hallmark program, and a gathering space for dances, demonstrations, and other programs. These different facets of the center are important because they signal how Pueblo peoples collectively enable the cultivation of unique and distinct worldviews in history. As far as I can tell, the radio did not come to fruition. However, the Pueblo newspaper, Pueblo News, did, and it ran from 1974 to 1984. In addition, there was a short-lived newspaper, Pueblo Focus, up on the top there. The newspaper and the newsletter are significant because they allow Pueblo citizens like myself access to Pueblo elders and knowledge keepers when recollecting histories, such as this one here. In addition, the library and archives actively combat historical silences that occur within dominant institutions and allow Pueblo people to determine how, when, why, and what it preserves for future generations. In addition, for the All Indian Pueblo Council to articulate the need for repatriated items in 1975, while not explicitly using that word, is significant because it signals a historically expressed want of Pueblo peoples prior to the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990. As well, the Hallmark program from 1976 was a Pueblo precursor to the Indian Arts and Crafts Act of 1990. The Indian Pueblo Cultures Center's conceptualization, development, and opening were landmark opportunities that contribute to the continual development and expression of Pueblo culture in the current-day United States. The negotiations that secured the land for the Cultural Center, fundraising accomplishments, and grand opening celebrations demonstrate the unity, strength, strategic planning, and political savvy of the 19 Pueblos. The center's architectural style announces a continued Puebloan presence in the center of Albuquerque, New Mexico. On August 28, 1976, during the grand opening, the Indian Pueblo Culture Center manifested their original mission to express Pueblo culture and tradition in order to promote and perpetuate our culture, in which Pueblo art, dance, and song were the primary features of the center's celebration. The purpose of my thesis was to expand upon the known information about the center's developmental stages because little is written about the center. By expanding this history, I hope that future Pueblo scholars will have substantial information to begin museology studies about the Indian Pueblo Culture Center and to investigate how the center benefits its Pueblo and non-Pueblo constituents, both rural and urban, and to determine future steps for the center so that it can continue to remain relevant. Decolonial museum practices continue to transform and expand, and I hope that by documenting the center's past, they will demonstrate how it has metamorphosed within the museum field. It is in my hope that Pueblo scholars may move beyond discourse of decolonization and head towards indigenization of museums, or for us, Puebloification, in which I hope the center contributes. There's so much more that I wish I could share with you, a whole decade of history that I could share with you. So I just really thank you for this time. Harkem. Thank you.
Stay up there and take questions. Maybe see if people on Zoom have questions first.
Not yet on Zoom.
Not yet?
Yes.
Of course, I'm interested in that amazing building.
Everyone is, yes.
Can you tell me a little bit? Do you know who the architect was, and if does it look like this still today? I couldn't quite tell from the initial image that you had. It looked more like Adobe, and was this also Adobe, or I don't know?
No, so Chaco Canyon was actually made of brick, so it wasn't made out of mud brick adobe. The plan for the Indian Pueblo Culture Center was created by, it was proposed by Harvey Hosher, and then Richard Chavez from San Felipe Pueblo. He was one of the lead designers who actually recommended Pueblo Bonito to be the foundation and that source for that design. And then afterwards, there are two other architects and I wish I had written them down on a piece of paper, but there are some additional pieces added to it, and those were both Native architects. One was a Cherokee and Caddo, and then the other, I can't remember right now. I wish I could tell you. But it still remains in the traditional deed, and then it has a few extra additions on it.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Yes.
Is there any progress on getting the rest of the school's land back?
So that's a wonderful question. Thank you for asking that. What had happened is that we originally got 11.6 acres back, and then slowly over time we've gotten more and more land back. And there's one a little tidbit of information. There's a Native American Community Academy that now is it's now the academy that used to be part of the Albuquerque Indian School, so that's always really fun. But currently, the All Indian Pueblo Council has regained 80 acres of land back in the middle of Albuquerque. Yeah.
Alicia, can you compare and contrast the IPCC with, say, the Poe Center as a cultural center, and maybe NMAI, and the different roles and ways in which they share responsibilities but also do different things?
Sure. So the Indian Pueblo Culture Center is really, there are two main audiences that are at work. One is tourists who come into Albuquerque who want to learn about Pueblo people, and maybe they don't know. This is generally a pretty safe space for people to learn about us. And it's also a space for us Pueblo people to come into an area in the middle of Albuquerque where we feel comfortable and where we feel like we have pride and dignity and respect. And the center, they feature dances, which is something that doesn't happen normally in a non-Pueblo, like a non-plaza space. So that's very unique for the Culture Center. In comparison, the Poe, which is in Pojoaque, Pueblo, they have a lot of workshops. And so they have like smithing, weaving, and I think that's a little bit different because from what I see with the Culture Center, it doesn't have the workshop as frequently as they used to in the past. That's one part, and then that's also very specifically serving Tewa speaking communities, whereas the Indian Pueblo Culture Center is serving all 20 Pueblo communities. So there's a little bit more like pan-Pueblo, I guess is like a way to put it. And then versus the NMAI, that's more of a museum. And so that's mainly centered around the collections that they hold within. Whereas the culture centers are really interested in bringing in people and bringing in like what Western non-native people would consider to be non-academics or non-experts, but we know that they're experts. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I have a comment.
Yes.
In the chat, Theodore says, "Thank you, Felicia. It's wonderful that you finally helped to document this story." And he also says, two other Native architects that added to IPCC, Lou Weller Cado and David Riley Laguna.
Yes,
I
David
apologize for the
Laguna, yes.
Excellent.
Thank you, Ted. Thank you.
Can I throw in one additional quick question? So one looks at the timeline, and it's, I thought, well, so late 60s, early 70s, civil rights movement, and is there a sort of connection? Would you say it's a part of a larger discussion about rethinking cultural heritage at that moment and recognizing the history of Native Americans more than had been the case before?
Yeah, so part of that was civil rights movement, and Pueblo people we're kind of always been in a really interesting area in the way that we're recognized by the government, because we've had dealings with Spain and Mexico. So whenever we, the Treaty of Hidalgo included us in, or Guadalupe Hidalgo, sorry, we were recognized as citizens already, but citizens without rights still. But that part, from what I understand, and this isn't really part of like the scope, and so I wish I could have a better answer. What I understand is part of that movement enabled the All Indian Pueblo Council to develop and strategize to have more dealings with the federal government in a way that was recognized by the United States. Because previously, I didn't include this, but the council, there's the written record that says that the council was established in 1598 when the Juan de Oñate first came into Pueblo country. And then there's the oral history that says that the council has been around since time immemorial. Some records say that when our neighbors came in, our Navajo and Apache neighbors came in, that's when they developed a council.
Thank you. All right, I'm gonna ask Miranda to come up. Our second speaker today is Miranda Worrell, who has come here with a bachelor's in anthropology from Dartmouth College. And we are excited to hear about her thesis on recommendations for the Alaska State Museum Code of Ethics on the Rights of Native Peoples. And in this work, she has been supported by Steve Lubar here at Brown, Nadia Sethi at the CIRI Foundation, and Anjali Grantham at the Alaska State Museum. I know.
Gunishchish hat yayadi, yak e away ye a awal geni, ach tua sigu, shkach dedenge, kagwech ayach sayi, tleka kenach, Miranda Worrell, yukat duasak. So I am Tlingit Filipino, Kagwantan from Glacier Bay in the village of Hoonah, Alaska. My father's people are from the Chilkat region and village of Klukwan. These are my people's ancestral lands, which are very much different from the indigenous lands that I'm standing on and where our event takes place today. I want to respect the peoples of this region that I share a modern indigenous identity with, and I want to very intentionally note that as I give this presentation, I am in their ancestral homelands. Although sharing a sense of solidarity in colonial contexts, their cultural values and histories are distinct from my own comprehensions of indigeneity and being Alaska Native, present in the work I'm talking about today. So my thesis I'll be submitting are suggestions for improvements to the Alaska State Museum Code of Ethics regarding the rights of Alaska Native peoples. These recommendations plant seeds and adjust trajectory in the institutional language and philosophical focus of the museum in order to fortify relationships between museum staff and Alaska Native peoples, communities, tribes, and entities. The emphasis of these recommendations derive directly from the need to incorporate Alaska Native contexts and values into museum operations. The recommendations are focused on incorporating Alaska Native values and adding to the museum's institutional ethical code. All recommendations were considered and guided by asking, what is the best way to move forward now? I summarized these recommendations by pulling out 5 suggestions that capture the framework on which I built my thesis project. So to very briefly go over them, first, incorporate indigenous expertise and knowledges. Second, revisit museum foundations and collections. For example, are there ways to reshape language around possession, access, and control as a way to properly acknowledge Alaska Native rights to their material and intangible forms of culture, not present in the current written legal policies of museum documents? Third, treat land acknowledgement as the floor and not the ceiling. This is a quote shared by Ayukasatuk, and what it means is that land acknowledgement is important, but it is also a starting point for ethical practice and respect for Alaska Native rights and sovereignty. Fourth, incorporate language that addresses colonial structures and histories, while also adding ethical practice based in Alaska Native values. And finally, support Alaska Native futurity. The Code of Ethics must ensure the museum's commitment to valuing and considering future generations of Alaska Natives in daily museum work and practice. A museum code of ethics Traditional focus is on an inward-facing form of ethics to maintain institutional integrity. Addressing the rights of Alaska Native peoples means shifting to a more outward-facing ethics, focused on service to publics and communities. In my thesis, I worked through a series of difficult theoretical issues, including how to decolonize and indigenize a colonial space, and how to merge museum institutional ethics with Alaska Native ones. However, there is still the immediate and day-to-day imperative by museums and collaborators to be ethical. Between now and the time Alaska Native ethics are fully recognized and inherent in public and non-Native spaces is all the work it takes to get to that point and the immediate possibilities for more positive relationships between museums and Alaska Native peoples. So how can this be done? There are a few theoretical tools or intellectual frameworks that I've used for this project to help me. By planting seeds, I focus on immediate actions and current essential priorities that propagate future possibilities to work with the slow change that is associated with museums. And adjusting the trajectory is a concept that any small change made today will have an exponential impact on our future generations. Radical alterity is a philosophical concept applied to person-to-person relationships between strangers that asks people to look to alternative ways of conducting oneself in the presence of a stranger, despite knowing virtually nothing about them. That we have the capacity to acknowledge experiences of others without a need to actually know what they are. Imaginative ethics is pulled from a context of clinical ethics, which calls for the imagination of alternative horizons of moral experience and human life to be taken seriously, and accepts that some facts are morally relevant while others are not. Together, I use radical alterity and imaginative ethics as a tool in my thesis work to bring forward new modes of ethical thought and creation in the acceptance and understanding of the unknowable, and begin to place cultural values and spirituality of Alaska Natives at the center of human histories, rather than a need for complete narratives. I use them to respect in the presence of and not in spite of the unknowable forms of knowledge and histories of Alaska Native communities, and to focus more on taking what is essential to carry forward with us and what is enough information and knowledge to hold contemporary lives and thoughts accountable, and to do justice to Alaska Native ancestral peoples and their histories. Through one lens, the work we do today in the present is a part of the future, in that it heavily impacts and shapes the environment future generations live in. And if our work reaches into the future, we can also view what we do today as being a part of the historical past, in that it is the ancestral work that future generations will look upon. Weaving these together is a part of Wochiach and Tlingit, a value that I grew up with, and also one shared by Alaska Natives in their love and consideration for their children, grandchildren, and those yet to come. My thesis project centers Alaska Native perspectives and voices, bearing in mind future generations of Indigenous peoples on the lands and waters. What are the current concerns and needs of Alaska Native peoples as it relates to their future hopes, visions, and aspirations? In the same way, a code of ethics must consider the Indigenous lives that inhabit not just the past and present Alaskan landscape, but future too. This approach also calls upon non-Native publics and museum staff to collaborate and respect the cultural heritage, values, and knowledge of Alaska Native peoples. So my thesis also considers ethics that make it possible for Native and non-Native peoples to work in productive, respectful, and responsible ways. Alaska Native expertise, traditional knowledges, and cultural values enhance authenticity in all aspects of the museum's work and practice. This is what I incorporate into my recommendations to help the museum get to where it wants to be in terms of authenticity and inclusivity. And in many ways, the recommendations bridge the gap between what is included in the Alaska State Museum's Code of Ethics and what is not, but already being practiced on a day-to-day basis by staff at the museum today. Ultimately, I want non-Natives to not only respect and value, but be inspired by Alaska Native peoples and their cultural heritage, to want to learn more about and from the beauty of Alaska Natives. And just to return to who this work is for, in doing this thesis project, I have always kept in mind visions for future generations, which include not just those not yet in being, but also those already living. Alaska Native youth, such as my nieces and nephews, which I don't know if they're awake yet, back home in Alaska, but shout out to Elena May, Polly, Madison, and Michaela. The experiences I've had in museums in my childhood have not always been positive. I was lucky enough to grow up with unconditional love and support from my family. I think that allowed me to grow up where I was never ashamed of my Tlingit heritage and of my grandparents and elders. This was not always the case for many others when I was growing up. But just because I was not ashamed does not mean that I was able to easily, openly, and proudly wear my heritage in schools and non-Native spaces. Nor was I given as many opportunities as Native youth are now. But I see our future generations, my nieces and nephews. I see how proud Alaska Native youth are, how well they speak their native languages, and how much pride they already hold for their connection to their culture and heritage. The work I'm doing is for them because it will show just how much love I hold for them. The Code of Ethics project is a small piece, but also a beginning to the work I do in love and respect for future generations. So I'll just end with, I look forward to continuing my work in education and advocacy for Alaska Native peoples. Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, that was so amazing and beautiful. You had said this phrase about like thinking about facts that are morally relevant, and I love that idea, but I would love to hear you talk more about that or kind of how you're using that.
Yeah, I think in this aspect, and I know, so Kennedy and I shared an ethics class with Diana O'Donoghue this past spring, and so I think I've talked about this a bit. And it's included in, I think, the more creative aspects of my thesis paper. But I really look at, I think, a lot of the current national news that's going on around boarding schools. And I think a lot of people back home wanting to take advantage, especially I think heritage centers feel this imperative and need now to really face those histories. What that implies, I think, in order to receive justice for Alaska Native peoples and restitution, can also ask, I think, an unethical, like, crossing a boundary for, I think, elders and even, you know, like, not even elders, but like uncles and aunties that I have that are not ready to share these experiences of boarding schools. And so how do we still, I think, acknowledge those histories, empathize with them, and present them in exhibitions without having, I think, to push, I think, on elders and I think put that weight on people who are not ready to share their experience. So that's sort of, I think, the way I've looked at it in this context. But yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for your presentation. That was so beautiful. I also just want to follow up on Kennedy's question and your response, which I found really beautiful. Particularly linking it to the aspect of your presentation where you raised radical alterity and imaginative ethics as a framework. I found that really, really generative in terms of how you framed it as an acceptance of the unknowable, right? And it feels like a sort of rejection of mastery of knowledge as a form of Western conquest, right? So just in terms of what you shared right now with your family members who still feel, pensive about sharing some of their experiences within these spaces, I'm wondering just because so many indigenous critiques talk about the sacred aspects of their knowledges and how not all of that belongs within the university or academia or institutional spaces. So I'm wondering if that's been a point of tension in your work and the knowledge that your family has generated in terms of if you're tethering between wanting to share and publicize some of these experiences while maintaining this level of sacred knowledge is?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, and I think it comes up a lot. And go back here, like the first recommendation that I make, I think I especially grappled with how to incorporate Indigenous expertise and knowledge. And to that, I think I'll say it's very tribally specific in that I think I'm from, so just from my experience, I'll just share for Tlingit people, it's very different from what I just shared in terms of, I think, sacred knowledge. And that the way, like Tlingit values and style is that a lot of the way we express, I think, ownership is actually through, I think, publicly and through public spaces and realms, in the sense of like having ceremonies where you have all the clans present, and it's an acknowledgement in front of everyone. And so that's very different, I think, than you'll see in other tribes where there are certain knowledge that is just like not shareable. And it's just very specific and very different in the treatment. So I felt okay sharing, I think, from my own personal perspective, and I have a case study that is specific to Tlingit people, but again, it's going to be on a case-by-case basis, and whether it's tribal knowledge or, I think, colonial histories that are being shared, that also makes a difference.
I have a comment on chat from Julie Grantham. I look forward to sharing this with my colleagues at the Alaska State Museum and other Alaska museums. This is so helpful for, quote, adjusting the trajectory, as Miranda says.
Question.
Yeah.
Can I ask you to reflect on, since this is public humanities, to reflect on the piece of this that connects to the public? So, you know, connecting to the museum and, you know, taking the kind of deep knowledge and ontology and epistemology and theoretical foundations and all of that, and actually connecting it to a very practical activity, and kind of what your experience of that was, and how you might take that experience and make recommendations to other people about similar projects.
Actually, yeah, I'll share this slide again. I think I was able to do a lot of that actually this past spring. I took that class with Diane O'Donoghue, again, I'll give a shout out, just because I learned so much, and it really pushed me, I think, in an academic sense. It was the first time I encountered a lot of philosophical histories and different terminologies, such as radical alterity and imaginative ethics. But I think for me, I think the way I really think about like academics and what I'm here and what I'm trying to learn is I'm really trying to center it back home. And so as I've been going through this, this entire thesis project, I think at the back of my mind is always, I think, this fear. It would be my greatest fear, and I've talked to Steve about this, that I do all this work, I bring in this theory, I bring it back home, I show my family, and they tell me, well, how is this useful? What can we do with this? So that's really the guiding, I think, practice that I have and that I take in every class. I really look at all of these theories, struggling through once I finally figure out what they're saying, figure out, okay, how is this useful back home? What's maybe not so useful? But yeah, thanks for that question.
Today is Ariel Lynch. Come on. So Ariel has come here with her undergraduate degree in art history from Boston College and is going to give a presentation on her thesis project titled Resonance, Notes on Love and Sound. And this work has been supported by Sophie Abramowitz here and Diane O'Donoghue, both here at Brown.
Hi everyone, my name is Ariel, and I'm going to talk to you in a very brief presentation about my master's thesis, which is titled Resonance, Notes on Love and Sound. In a deviation from the traditional thesis model, my thesis is composed of a collection of 4 notes or short-form essays on key topics that I've found my work centering on during my time at Brown. Those being appropriation, collections, popular culture, and resonance. My thesis project is highly inspired by the poet Hanif Abdurraqib's 2021 book, A Little Devil in America, Notes and Praise of Black Performance. In A Little Devil in America, Abdurraqib reflects on the ways in which Black performance has influenced American popular culture on the whole. His exaltation of Black performance is informed by his life and experiences with these moments of performance. In Resonance, I aim to work similarly, through the incorporation of my own lived experience and items from my family's collections, including photographs and music. I use an autoethnographic and sometimes psychoanalytic methodology to approach larger questions and conflicts surrounding Black sound. I'd also like to note that this thesis is a creative production. I've tried to incorporate image and sound into every part of this project, and I think that's best seen in my tiny exhibit, which is outside. Please check it out. And also, before I provide a closer explanation into my notes on love and sound, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to my thesis advisor, Sophie Abramowitz, and thesis committee member, Diane O'Donoghue, for all their help in getting my work to where it is now. There are truly no words to express how much I appreciate your insight and graciousness with me during this thesis writing process, so I will keep it simple and say thank you. All right. Note 1 is about appropriation. Behind me, you see a still from a video I shot at a concert that I attended in March of this year with my friend and interlocutor, Ray. At this concert, Ray and I quickly realized that we were some of the only Black members in the audience. In the image, you see a young white fan of the rapper Baby Keem, who was invited on stage, and in the moment I captured on film, you witness the very end of Baby Keem's set when the fan was offered the mic and used that opportunity to flippantly voice his frustration that the concert was ending and Keem didn't continue to play the music of his cousin, Kendrick Lamar. In Note 1, I reflect on this concert experience. I'm firstly informed by my feelings of discomfort, frustration, and really anger, and raise questions about the idea of ownership in relationship to Black sounds and sonics. This reflection has offered me a space to work through some of my own essentialist and often unhelpful tendencies when it comes to defining Black music. In doing so, I note my personal stake in protecting and defending and loving Black music, and put this experience in conversation and in contrast with listening experiences of non-Black fans of Black musical genres. In doing so, I express the dark humor of my experience at the concert and the futile nature of attempting to use essentialist means to define sonics while highlighting the undeniable differences between Black and non-Black listening experiences of Black sound. In Note 2, I write about collections. I'm thinking about my family's music collection, but pay close attention to the record collection of my father, whose photograph you see behind me. My father died when I was very young, and I have no living memory of him. And in this note, I reflect on my relationship with my father and the metaphor between my experience as a daughter growing up without a father and our family's possession of his vinyl collection, that we no longer have a record player to listen to it with. Based on feedback from Diane O'Donoghue, I've centered my focus on the process of music and sound as providing materiality to his memory. Although I do not remember him, I can hear him and in many ways feel him. In her 2017 book, Listening to Images, Tina Campt writes, I theorize sound as an inherently embodied process that registers at multiple levels of the human sensorium. Sound need not be heard to be perceived. Sound can be listened to, and in equally powerful ways, sound can be felt. It both touches and moves people. In this way, sound must therefore be theorized and understood as a profoundly haptic form of sensory contact, end quote. This centering on the haptic nature of sound is critical to my analysis of my own relationship with my father and how I can use sound and resonance as frameworks for tackling more complicated social and cultural phenomena. This is a photo of me when I was 3 years old. In Note 3, I write about myself and my relationship with popular culture. I'm focusing on the year of 2014. 2014 is the year I got my driver's license and listened to music on CDs because that was the only way I could in my first car. I write about my favorite album of the year, the Platinum Edition of Beyoncé's self-titled album. And I reflect on the cultural moment of 2014 through my own life as a 16-year-old. And in this year, it's a moment that I feel like is really informed by the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement, a tumultuous political scene, and a lot of hormones. Note 4 is about resonance. Resonance is the quality and a sound of being deep, full, and reverberating. I address in this note how it intersects with my own understanding of self and informs my scholarship. Resonance and correspondingly reverberation have been helpful frameworks in thinking through the ways that sound travels not only physically, but generationally. This is kind of all I have written, and I wanted to just talk a little bit off the cuff of how I imagine this all coming together. But I hope it's coming across that there is a vein of love through my use of, one, my own memories, and familial relics that I'm sharing with you all, and thinking of the way that these things like truly do offer reverberations and resound. Yeah, that's all I have. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, yes. So, I love this project, and I love hearing about it, and every time I hear about it, I learn something new. It's such a generative and beautiful thing. So, first off, thank you. Second, I am privileged to have the knowledge of how many different ways that this project has changed and developed since its inception in the fall. And I was wondering if you would be interested in sharing kind of all the different shapes it's taken in order to bring you here.
Sure. So this is Sophie, my thesis advisor. And like I mentioned, this work is very informed by themes that I keep finding myself attempting to work through in different contexts and in different classes. So in the first class I took with Sophie in my first semester here, I was thinking through appropriation, and in many ways popular culture by looking and thinking more critically about the history of blackface minstrelsy in the country. And then in another class I took with Sophie this past fall called Race and Sound, I worked through exploring sonic histories, thinking of the ways the poem Strange Fruit has been translated into song and then sampled in more recent music. And this project was originally going to be definitely a more formal thesis with two very distinct chapters. The first looking very closely at appropriation through the music of Justin Timberlake and his cornrows. And a second chapter investigating the capaciousness and fullness of sound in a way that I don't think I ever fully got a handle on, and that translated into this project because I feel like I kind of needed to work out my own feelings and relationship and personal stake in these ideas to get to a larger project.
Yes.
I thought it was really a wonderful, very powerful presentation. It occurred to me that apart from talking about sound, there's also an enormous strength in your images, and with your text coming at the same time, the images of suddenly they were sort of everyday images, and they acquired this amazing poetic quality, especially your sort of family's images of your father's amplifiers and all these things. It was just great. I noticed that the first image, very beautiful, that you took at that concert was black and white and stood out quite different from the others, and it seemed like a really conscious choice, and I think really well done, the way you manipulate that image in such a way that it was so cold and stark and still very, very beautiful. I wonder if you could talk about that contrast, how you sort of made that decision to do the first one in black and white and then the others so different, and and how you used images in that way. I thought that was really striking.
Sure, thank you for asking this question. Like I mentioned, a creative endeavor as well, so I've been trying to tap into the creative side of my mind. As you can imagine, this was shot in color on my phone, but I decided to grade it in black and white because I imagine when I have the physical copies of my thesis, I want to print this as a zine and I want to print it in black and white. I am a very novice photographer, but I only like to shoot on black and white film. And I think that in black and white, even though like a lot of the images that I have of my family are in, and just like of, and other things are shot in color, I think like bringing them to black and white kind of like you're focusing on, I don't know, the heart of these images. So
you will bring the others to black and white?
Yes, yeah.
I was just taken by that contrast because family images are obviously different from this particular recent experience, which was, you know, very complex as you pointed out. And so I enjoyed the difference. But anyway, that's going to watch the final version with great interest. Fascinating.
Can I ask you a question about resonance?
Yes.
So my question is about the kind of relationship between resonance and the methods that you're using, because it seems like one of the ideas of an autoethnographic project is to create something that's from deep lived experience, but also it travels in some way, and so it seems to kind of be just another layer of the resonance, because you're deeply create something that resonates with other people. Does that seem reasonable?
Yes, 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 well said. And I think that I'm imagining this project is kind of like foundational to future work, but like I mentioned, I found it really important to kind of like work through my personal stake in these issues to kind of like get to the heart of like what resonance as a framework like means amidst my many interests in like popular culture and music studies and things like that. Yeah.
Other questions?
Yes.
Thank you so much for your beautiful presentation, Ariel. I really love how you frame sound as a sort of haptic and affective experience. And so I just find that such a beautiful intervention in traditional understandings of archives that have historically relied on modes of documentation as representation according to Western epistemologies. So I'm wondering how your project sort of intervenes in being able to posit sound as affect and an affective experience. So I'm wondering how you thought through your project as an intervention in traditional understandings of archive through the haptic and through affect.
Yeah, okay, thank you for this. So actually what this is making me think of is after the last time I presented this, you shared a quote with me from one of your favorite artists, Doreen Garman.
Thank you for remembering.
Yes. Oh, I thought about it for a long time. But they said that they want their work to be felt, not understood. And I think that as I've been working, like especially with like my own family's archival materials, it's feeling that is like the only thing that I'm getting from these. Like it is affect, it's love, I think is like how I'm framing it. But in many ways, it's I think a lot deeper than that. How this is offering an intervention, I don't know. More to come, I suppose. But I think that even in just like creating this project that's fully inspired by my own feelings and not necessarily like this attempt to, I don't know, theorize formally in the way that we're taught to in the academy, that feels radical. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So our last presentation today is from Ray Terry. And so Ray has come to us from Brandeis with an undergraduate major in Afro-American Studies and is presenting untitled work today. And he's supported in this work by Sophie, again, as well as Aliyah Abdurrahman in American Studies here. So, Ray.
Thank you. Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Quote from Jarrett Drake. The earliest archival repositories in the United States were the private historical societies and manuscript libraries of New England and the mid-Atlantic regions of the nascent nation. Their primary purpose was not to assemble an archive for the new idea of America, nor was it to be accessible to everyone. Instead, these institutions largely collected family papers of the wealthy merchants, enslavers, and politicians who funded these operations. I've spent the last 2 years working as an intern at the nation's fourth eldest of such an institution, the Rhode Island Historical Society. This year, they're celebrating their 200th anniversary of their founding, and a newspaper article from that period was recently brought out and displayed. The article was a call to the Rhode Island public to aid in gathering the society's establishing collections, stating that while they were sure they could rely on citizens' patriotism to motivate their donations, they also knew that the population's hearts would warm at the recollection of the efforts of the various prominent Rhode Island families, the Brown family among them. It states that they knew such a society would meet with every encouragement, since the history of the state will be but an enlarged biography of their ancestors. Rhode Island, and previously known as Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, was the single largest slave port in the U.S. and single-handedly comprises the top point of the transatlantic slave trade triangle. To this day, the state is largely bereft of memorials to the Black lives that built the wealth, the streets, the buildings, which are littered with tributes to the families whose wealth these Black and Indigenous people built. While archives are dominated by narratives of these wealthy families, they only contain fragments of Black lives, often in a state of violation, coming into direct contact with the racist legal apparatus as experiments in scientific methodologies and exploited as visual spectacles. As Marisa Fuentes puts it, violent systems and structures of white supremacy produced devastating images of enslaved female personhood, which pervade the archive and govern what can be known about them. There they remain in stasis, as traditional Western archives typically leave little room for impermanence. There is something pornographic about the zoological impulse to capture, pin down, classify, and hold objects of domination, evidence of power ad infinitum. In archives, objects of memory, remnants of life after death, are regulated, individualized, dated, marked, described, shelved. The lives of the enslaved or those in servitude to the wealthy class are fragmented, misrepresented, the exterior view of them not allowed to pass. The gaze is fiercely invasive and permanent. It is a system that does not allow for death, let alone grief or mourning. Jarrett Drake has written at length about the parallels between prisons and archives, focusing on the structure of archives as one of surveillance, the reading room a panopticon, which holds certain items in and keeps certain people out. My concern here is more with the objects, the shadows of lives past, that archives hold as the primary technology in which the history of Western humanity has been kept, stewarded, and reproduced in the public. Constituted on the principle of Black people as the extreme opposite of man, archives are not neutral, universal repositories of information, but spaces which hoard and hold entanglement and continued violence for Black and other marginalized people. Full with the splendors of their wealthy donors held in memoriam, archives are urgently in need of new infrastructure to hold everything forever. The buildings are full, the museums are full, the warehouses and basements that line the middle of the country are full of hundreds of thousands of magnetic tapes that are full and nearly obsolete. The societal shift to born digital material has caused a crisis never imagined by the historical workers of centuries past. Environmentally, there is simply nowhere left to store this stuff. So, archives turn now to synthetic DNA, where data will be able to be stored in volumes previously unseen. What is an archive of memorial if the archive is alive? What does it mean to archive in a perpetual state of grief? This thesis wants to implore us to ask what it would mean to build archives otherwise, what it would look like for archives to insist on holding a mood and then changing it, to allow documents and materials to flow, to pass through, to be transferred, transitioned, allowed to develop, change, to decay. So that's a little bit of the archive side, and then the other side is this sort of vibratory network that I'll read a little bit of as well before I get to my sound. Another quote from Jarrett Drake. Archives are a type of death management work. Archival repositories represent the documentary final resting places of a person's lived experiences. Archives manage lives after death. If we were to trace the genesis of the Black diaspora to the Middle Passage, we would have to know that the diaspora was not that of a single people dispersed throughout the globe, but many peoples brought together for a period and then redispersed. It is in this transitional space, no longer connected to their home communities and not yet at their next destination, that a diasporic community may have been forged. These people were from many different groups with different languages, cultures, customs. Their languages, their ways of being, however, would have been at least more familiar to one another than that of their captors. In such a predicament, enemies become friends, and that which was foreign becomes familiar. In such a predicament, a new way to communicate must arise, and this I will call for the purpose of this thesis, a common vibration. When we hear, microscopic hairs vibrate our eardrum, which become encoded as neurons. Our bodies and brains communicate by sending these neurons through synapses, which are two chemical receptors between which there is a space called a cleft where the neural signal jumps, transitions from synapse to synapse to continue its path. The more we do an action, the stronger the synapses become, the easier an action is. The less we use them, the weaker they become. It is a system that is at once subconscious and voluntary. One way to think about the cleft between the synapses, the space of transition, is to think about a playlist. Imagine for a moment that where one song ends is one side of the synapse, and where the next song begins is the other side of the synapse. The space between them is the cleft, the break, the transitory space. The space of transition opens a plane of agency where we're attuned to our own mood, our own being, our own interpretation of the sound we just heard, and the anticipation of the next sound we are going to hear. While short, the space is capacious, not empty but full of dynamic suggestion where something else is illuminated. This space is the axis of the vibratory network of Black culture, the space where the mood can change, where a new expression becomes possible. So, in the transitional space of the Middle Passage, in this cleft or break between here and there, these people had to find a way to communicate. And this was done through the finding of a common vibration. This is to say that while the specific languages being spoken may not have been understood, there was a common word or intonation or grammar which vibrated the eardrum in a certain way, more familiar than that which came from their captors. As across this common vibration, across the break between the synapses, and the transition between here and there, meaning could be made, not just through language, but also through movement, gesture, dance, song, and other ways of signaling. The neurons fire, and while it is not a perfectly clear translation, the feeling, the mood can be known. Perhaps not enough for an everyday conversation, but enough to express anger, to express sadness, enough to plot rebellion, and enough to survive. Enough to remember and forge and sustain an enduring communal identity outside the perception of the captor and later the enslaving societies. Vibrations slide through the synapse in the space between here and there, illuminating a common frequency which is enfolded into the choreosonic performance of a new diasporic community. While much of the choreosonic performance of Black life has bled into various functions of Western society, archives remain a space untouched by its influence. This is also the reason that archives are such violent spaces for Black people. This is also the reason that archives have been the vertebrae of Western civilization. They're totally oriented towards the capturing and preservation of historical evidence and the upholding of nationalist narratives. What can an archive be if its main tenet was not the preservation of documents deemed important for historical evidence? What would it mean for archives to shift into the space between the synapse, to illuminating the ephemeral, ungraspable moments which are heavy with valuable information? We pass down Bibles, perfumes, clothing, jewelry, and after so many generations, these objects are depleted or are lost. Objects, like life, like moods, are not made to last forever. They're made to serve their function and then disappear into dust like the rest of us. Our purpose is not to hoard them and keep them frozen in time. It is to honor them and what they meant to our ancestors. To be an archivist is to be a steward and a caretaker. It does not have to mean to classify, categorize, and sort, to store and keep away from grubby fingers or hungry eyes. For Black archives, ephemeral archives, it is to elucidate and illuminate those moments that have passed, that cannot be captured, and this can only be done by reversing the archival process, to keep objects in a constant state of motion, of transition, to be able to observe the various moods and changes of mood. It's just a little bit of it. And then I want to play my little sound that I made. It's not done, but you know, it's here. All right.
A child's experiences during the earliest years of life have a lasting impact on the architecture of the developing brain. Genes provide the basic blueprint, but experiences shape the process that determines whether a child's brain will provide a strong or weak foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. During this important period of brain development, billions of brain cells called neurons send electrical signals to communicate with each other. These connections form circuits that become the basic foundation of brain architecture. Circuits and connections proliferate at a rapid pace and are reinforced through repeated use. Our experiences and environment dictate which circuits and connections get more use. Connections that are used more grow stronger and more permanent. Meanwhile, connections that are used less fade away through a normal process called pruning. Well-used circuits create lightning-fast pathways for neural signals to travel across regions of the brain. Simple circuits form first, providing a foundation for more complex circuits to build on later. Through this process, neurons form strong circuits and connections for emotions, motor skills, behavioral control, logic, language, and memory during the early critical period of development. With repeated use, these circuits become more.
I guess the term that I learned to use to describe that building of the stairway. You know, I learned it from Nathaniel Mackey, and he learned it from Amiri Baraka, and I think, you know, Baraka learned it from whoever, David Walker, Frederick Douglass, you know, Harry Jacobs, you know, is fugitivity. Right. Yeah, which implies, again, is not only running from, but also running towards. Yeah. And yet, at the same time as I recognized that, yeah, they were building something, a stairway to get out of that place. Where I'm trying to get to is that place. Like that day, like those 2 days, that feeling, that refusal of the distinction between audience and performer.
Here in this place, we are flesh. Flesh that weeps, laughs, dances barefoot in the grass. Love your flesh. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love our flesh. Oh, my people, they do not love your hands. jump off and be lifted. Love your hands. Raise them up and kiss them.
Hold it, ma. We made work, blanket in a grave, punching holes through the dirt. And I dirty my skirt, had the monsters for dessert. And I turned down that perk, cause that loud just don't help me work. I'm from Kush, bitch, architects of the world, yeah, we built this shit, more shit. Look, ma, we made it, almost 100,000 coming over on them slave ships, and that's just one ship. I'm in one big room and everything basic, just face it like. Look, ma, we made it. Only lost 100,000 coming over on them slave ships. And that's just one ship, motherfucker, I'm traded. I'm in one big room and everything basic, just face it. These motherfuckers just can't take it. They call it hatred, but it's more than that.
And if you think about funerals, if you think about mourning, it's how do the living and the dead go together? How do they remain together?
You make my day. You came my way. You made my day. You came my way.
And that's it. All right. It's two. We don't have to do questions.
Little about, this is such an amazing collage. Authorship, so there were some sounds that, obviously there were some, recordings and very important statements and so on. There was also sort of sound effects that sound as if certain sounds had been recorded and then played backwards. I wonder if you could say just a little bit about how you put it together and what your thought was behind.
Yeah, well, I'm still working on it. It's actually an old version. I don't like it. I'll just listen to it. But the part that you hear that's in reverse is actually this performance that Abby Lincoln and Max Roach did. This triptych called Prayer, Protest, Peace. And so it's like sort of non-lyrical singing and then like the sort of screaming and then sort of more peaceful moaning kind of happens at the end. And it's sort of just had like a chokehold on me since I was like a teenager. And when I was making my film Entering Beyond last year, it just ended up being the thing that grounded it. And I sort of keep returning to it. I made another sound piece, maybe for Sophie's class last year, maybe for Aaliyah's class, unclear. That was that entire recording, sort of with a context of enslavement. That I think like Ariel's heard it, and I decided pretty early on that I just didn't want anybody to hear it. But I started thinking about how I could still use it to change the mood and to sort of like practice what I preached. So I thought that was a good way to still utilize it, but differently. Yeah.
And the technique was analog or all digital?
Digital. For
also,
now.
even the backward sounding thing you can.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
So, yeah, I mean, I've been thinking about your work for a long time now, and like I said, here's Ariel, like, it changes for me every time I re-experience it. So it's cool to hear this recording in kind of a different context.
I gotta send you the new one.
Sure is. So your work with like the break and the wake and transitional space, I was listening for that specifically this time, and I kept thinking like, I don't know, I think it was that Moten who said, how do they remain together? I heard like not what I associate with a break or a wake, which is like between songs, a pause, maybe like a thin sound. I heard like this like thickness, and, like these layers, which kind of defied my expectations and also made me rethink your theories of Blackness in the archive. And I was wondering if you could speak to that kind of like transition as thickness, as layers, as something other than a pause as we usually think of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm sort of, as I'm writing, I'm sort of digging deeper and deeper into that space. Specifically, I was talking to Aaliyah about it last week, and she was saying that like the Black ecstatic, which is where I'm sort of pulling a lot of my sort of theoretical grounding from, is actually about the feeling of like being beyond this place, but also being in the present moment. Like it's a very present thing. And so I guess thickness. You know, it's like Jerome Ellis, your friend who you had in our class last year, talks about, you know, the sort of the thickness of silence. I guess my thing when I'm making stuff is that like I sort of can't even deal with silence because I get bored. But sort of trying to like, basically like in the transitional moments, trying to illuminate like whatever that space is, and I need to be better at that. Actually, in the new one, there's actually a moment where I have a woman talking about being trans and creating an archive, and then immediately following that, like Erykah Badu comes on and she's like, transition, and she starts singing about her friend who died. So, working on it. But yeah, I don't know. I guess it's like thinking about this space that's not an empty space, but is sort of both present and beyond at the same time. Yeah, I don't know if that makes any sense. I'm in it. Anybody else? No? Ariel?
Hi, Ray. I have a question for you. And hopefully this can be useful for you, but I think as I've been was working on my presentation for this work, I've been trying to place myself in the field and the academy in this interdisciplinary space that we have with public humanities, but also Black studies. And I guess I'm just curious what disciplines you find yourself in conversation with and pulling from and influence from.
That's a good question. Yeah, well, I've been in Black studies for like 10 years now, I realized. So yeah, like Sophia said, like it's kind of all just in my head. I'm finding Aaliyah, first of all, like her essay, The Black Ecstatic, was really game-changing for me. And like every sentence that I write is somehow coming out of that. Moten keeps coming up, even though he's starting to get on my nerves. Alexander Wahelier comes up a lot. Yeah, it's ending up being this very like performance studies heavy thing. Where I was talking to Aaliyah last week, and she was like, I don't know how you ended up in public humanities, because it's very much giving performance studies. And I was like, yeah, I guess you're kind of right. Yeah, but still, I think for me, it's like, you know, like as an archivist, as a scholar, as an artist, it's really important to like still be grounded in actual physical archives and like, yeah, trying to like, I think with this thesis, I'm trying to like, there's like very clearly a marked difference between Black studies or even like any sort of scholarship and professional archival theory. And like, it's sort of this thing where like everybody in the scholarly world is like, archives are so violent, da 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 da, and like archivists are like, oh, like we're not unbiased, but like nobody's really doing the work of like bridging those things. And so part of, I think, what I wanted to do with this thesis is like just sort of make a space where those two things can align, because I'm thinking about it as like, first of all, this physical embodied archive in Blackness, and then also the other like archival, all these different sort of informational networks that I'm seeing, that I'm just like, now kiss. Yeah.